Good morning, Campus View. As we're kind of recording this right now, I want you to be thinking about my brother Ben Dyer, who would usually be here helping me, and he's just really feeling poorly, and he's going to be spending a day or two in the hospital with an infection. So just lift him and his family up in prayer. Most of you probably have been able to read the email that was sent out this past week about the fact that we're not going to be having services at least for the next 3 or 4 weeks. The shepherds are continuing to monitor the situation, and we just don't know what's going to happen at this point. So we'll keep monitoring things and communicating with you, and you know, if you've got any concerns, any needs at all, please call the shepherds or call myself. And Monday, tomorrow, there'll be an email going out that will advertise all the opportunities we have to participate in small groups and Bible studies through the Zoom media. And so you can just email me if you want to be a part of that, and I'll make sure you get included. Those of us that have participated in that's been a real wellspring of encouragement and joy. So I want to encourage you to do that. We're going to spend another week in the book of Joshua in this series, Strong and Courageous. And I really had some interesting feedback after last week, because the first week we talked about Joshua getting ready to cross the Jordan. We talked about sort of the impingement, the difficulty and the challenge that he faced with that, and how he needed to draw up courage, and he could do that because God was with him. And then last week we talked about Jericho and coming up to the city walls and marching around the city for 6 days, and how that just took perseverance and a continued trust in what God was telling him. But some of you are like, okay, Jerry, that was great. I mean, you told those stories, but you only told part of those stories. Like, you didn't tell the best part of those stories. You didn't tell the ending. You forgot to tell us about part 3. And I mean, that's a valid complaint, because good stories have an ending. And almost all good stories have 3 parts. One way you can sum it up is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, and then in part 3, boy finds girl. Another way you can think about that is that stories usually begin with some sort of stasis or some kind of semblance of home or normal, and then in part 2 there's a challenge or a threat that arises that creates a lot of disequilibrium, and then the part 2 contains more of that conflict and that struggle to overcome. And then finally in part 3 of the story, there's a resolution. There's a finding of a new home or a new way of being in the world. So why didn't I end Joshua's story? Why didn't we talk about the fact that when Joshua took that first step in the River Jordan, even though it was a flood stage, it was incredibly dry, and all of Israel crossed across on dry land, just like they had at the Red Sea? Or why didn't I finish the Jericho story with their march around the city on the 7th day, which they did 7 times, and with a great trumpet blast and a great shout, God tumbled those walls down, and they were able to overcome that struggle? Well, I got a lot of reasons. One is I'm trying to kind of reduce the time, and I knew that you would have familiarity with these stories, that you probably knew them, because they're stories that we've learned from young children if we've been reading the Bible or we've been part of a church family. A second reason was I hoped that maybe your kids would ask, how's that story end? And then maybe as families you would have a chance to finish reading Joshua 1 and 2 or finish reading Joshua chapter 6. But here's the real reason. The real reason was a setup for this morning. Because the truth is, even though most stories have kind of a part 1, a part 2, and a part 3, like 90% of the story is in part 2, right? Most of life is lived in the middle, in the struggle, in the conflict. And you'll find if any book, any movie, again, 80 to 90% is going to be in the middle. As followers of Jesus, we're sort of in this Uber story. And it does kind of have 3 parts, but the middle part is a little bit more complicated than most stories. We begin our story in God's Uber story, God's macro story, with God and His creation God as He meant things to be, God as He purposed things to be, God with us in the garden. And then in part 2, we have the struggle, we have the rebellion and the fall, and God in pursuit of His people, and God trying to win back His people. And part 2 is extended though, because there is a relief to the conflict. Jesus comes, God comes close, and He saves us, and He restores His people. But He doesn't completely finish the story. God's people are still in the world, and they're still in the struggle against evil, but things have drastically changed because now we know where the end is. Jesus' coming is kind of like the D-Day beachhead. We know now how it's going to end, and we have the presence of God with us, but we're still in the struggle. So some things have happened now, some things have yet to happen. And we look forward to part 3 when Jesus comes back and God comes back down to His creation, and earth and heaven are reunited and we're together with Him. Life is an Uber story. And because life's an Uber story, that means that our lives have meaning, and our lives have purpose, and our lives have this driving narrative towards an end. And we take great hope in that. And we understand, because we're wrapped up in what God is doing in the world, that even tragedy in our life, even unspoken tragedy, and the most painful tragedy, we know that if that tragedy is part of a story, then it has meaning. And if it has meaning, then it can be redeemed. Most of life, again, is caught up in the middle. It's caught up in the conflict, in the struggle, in the challenge. But because we're part of this macro story, we know what God's done in Jesus. We know the arc and the trajectory of where things are going towards God's new creation. But there's also this micro story. There's our lives that are caught up in this. And we're not sure how our lives are going to unfold. We're not sure how our parts are going to play out. We don't know what's going to happen in our own circumstances. And many of us in life, boy, it's so true in our society, we just want this guarantee that our circumstances are going to work out, that our life story is going to turn out just the way that we want it to. We want to make sure that all of our charts are up and to the right. I don't know if you've taken a look at your IRA recently, but you can tell all the charts are not up and to the right. And that's how our lives are usually. But we want things to come out. We want our stories to be self-written with all these guarantees. But here's one of the main points I want to make today. Really, it's the chief point. That what makes a great story and what makes a great adventure is the very fact that you have no guarantee about how things are going to unfold. What we need in our lives is a greater foundation than what's going to make my circumstances turn out in a pleasant, successful way. And that's what I want to talk about, because that's resilient faith. It's this idea of courage that we talked about 2 weeks ago, saddled up with this idea of perseverance through hope. No matter the circumstances, we have this courage to keep taking steps. We have this perseverance no matter what the circumstances, in this undying hope before us. So I want to kind of flip back, if you would, to Joshua chapter 2. Early in the Joshua story, there is an incredible example of resilient faith. It's the only other person, kind of living person in the narrative, that's actually mentioned in the first several chapters of Joshua, besides Joshua himself. And this example of resilient faith, we're introduced to this person, first of all, through their profession. And the first thing we're told about this person is they're a prostitute. Before they cross the Jordan, Joshua is going to send spies into the city. Spies ford the river, and they are going to go into Jericho. And as they're spying out Jericho, they soon discover that they're being looked for. That the king has become aware that these two spies, these two Israelite spies, have infiltrated their city. And they enter the home of this prostitute. Her name is Rahab. And for some reason, we're going to find out, Rahab decides to shelter them and hide them And she lies to her own people and saves their lives. And she finds a way for them to escape and return safely. And so I want to read you the reason why Rahab does this. This is in Joshua chapter 2, verse 9 through 13. She says, this is what she says to the spies while they're hidden in her house and she's about to let them go. She's already made this decision to put her life at risk. She says, I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. But it's not all about them. Listen to what Rahab said, right? Her heart's melting in fear, her courage. She says, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So she says, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare their lives and save us from death. It's an incredible statement of faith. If you think about this Canaanite woman living among her citizens, her own family in this town, and where she has staked her life. So they fulfill this promise to Rahab. They promise that since she's safe kept them, that they will make sure and they will not destroy her when they come to capture the city. And all they ask Rahab to do is to tie a scarlet cord and hang it out the window. She's obviously living on the outer wall. And they will see that scarlet cord hanging out the window, and that her household and all of her family that she gathers with her in that household will be spared. You think about Rahab's story, like the story of her life. I can't imagine the anxiety and the fear that surrounded this decision that she felt in this crisis when everybody was melting in fear, but she alone, she heard these stories. She has a startling confession of belief in the power of the God of heaven and earth. And so she stakes her future with God and his people over and against what's going on in her city, among all her countrymen, among all the citizens of Jericho. And when she makes this decision, Rahab has no idea how this is going to work out. She has no idea what her circumstances are going to be like in the very near future. The text is very clear in Joshua 2. Through her boldness and her courage, she is placing her foundation on God with no understanding of what the future holds or if it would even go her way. So to tell you the rest of the story, and boy, I invite you to read it, in her micro story, in the story of her life, we know that her family was saved in this crisis because of her faith, that her household was not destroyed, and that she and her family were allowed to live and habitate with the Israelites. But there's a really funny phrase that happens in the text. It says, so Rahab and her family lived with the Israelites, but they lived outside the camp. They now lived with these strange foreign people who worshiped this incredible, powerful God. They were among them, but they weren't really part of them. And so we look at Rahab's story, and we look at her circumstances, and yes, she was spared. Yes, her family was spared, but we still don't know how the story ends. She's still sort of in the middle with her family, not completely part of God's people, but part of the people that have been placed their faith in God. And so the story of Rahab ends in Joshua begging the question, what's going to happen to her? How's this all going to work out? But then there's this bigger uber story, this macro story. And it's interesting that when Joshua sends out the spies in chapter 2, he was never told by the Lord to do that. The Lord already had a plan for him to march around Jericho. The Lord had a plan that he himself, by his power, would bring down the walls of Jericho so the Israelites could capture the city. But Joshua on his own sent these spies in. But God uses this opportunity, and he uses the faith of Rahab, and he weaves her faith into his grand narrative. But we don't always get to see that. Rahab had no idea how her little part in this play in her life was going to work out in God's major story. Our lives are like that. We're consistently living in the middle. We have our experiences now. Think about what we're going through now with this COVID-19 and all the uncertainty. We don't even know what things are going to look like in 3 or 4 weeks. We have hopes, we have expectations, but we don't know. So we live in this time. I mean, it's just a great illustration, but it's really part and parcel of the way all of our lives are lived. Our lives are lived in trying and in failing, in rising and then falling again, in learning and growing, in encountering new challenges and threats, and sometimes overcoming, only to encounter more threats. I think another interesting thing that we find out about stories is that the protagonists in stories are always on two journeys. One is what we'd call the outer journey. It's the action and the steps and the responses that the main character takes. For Rahab, her outer journey is hiding the spies and helping them escape, and then her family being saved. But with the protagonist, there's also an inner journey. There's a story of what's going on in the inside, their fears, their anxieties, their beliefs, their confidences, their trusts. And for Rahab, that's what's going on in her heart and mind when she encounters the crisis of the Israelites. And it's the basis of her decision to hide the spies. Linda and I recently watched a movie called The Way Back with Ben Affleck, and he's one of my favorite actors. When we first meet Ben Affleck in the movie, he's the protagonist. What we meet is an alcoholic who is drowning in anger. He's barely making ends meet. I think he's just kind of taking day jobs as a construction worker wherever he can find work. He's definitely living in part two of his story, in the middle of life. It's not long before we realize really how difficult this middle is for him. He's lost his marriage. Then we discover that he was this incredible high school basketball phenomenon who had a full scholarship to play major college basketball at Kansas and would have been on his way to the pros, but he throws his chance away. And that's all rooted in this intense anger he has in this relationship with his father. And then we finally come to the tipping point, like, how did his life get so off track that he's lost his marriage and he's become an alcoholic and he's barely making ends meet? And we learn in the story that he has lost his only son to cancer. And so the outer journey of this movie is when the character, Ben Affleck's character, is given a chance to coach basketball at his alma mater. And the big outer journey of the movie is, can he take this group of misfit boys who lose every game they play and who fight each other and are totally undisciplined, can he take them and turn them into a winning team, maybe even a team that can make the playoffs? And can he turn them into champions? But then there's the inner journey of the story. Can he overcome the issues and the anger that is driving his life downward? Can transformation happen in his heart, in his beliefs, in his awareness? Really, the big question is, can he love again? Can he risk again? Now, here's my spoiler alert for this movie. The outer journey of the movie fails. And because of that, when you read the movie reviews, so many people just don't review the movie well. He has this incredible coaching ability, and he's able to turn these boys into a team, and they go on a playoff run. But before they can get to the championship, he's relapsed, he's fallen off the wagon, and he's fired. And things look like a complete failure. But before the movie ends, we get to see the inner journey. We get to see the transformation. We get to see the awareness of his loss and the facing of his anger. And we get to know that he is becoming a different kind of person. The circumstances aren't what we had hoped for at the end of the movie, but in his character, we know he's growing and he's no longer stuck. He is on his way back. It's this messy middle, this place where we wrestle with uncertainty and sometimes anxiety and challenge. This is a place in our lives of incredible opportunity and growth. And our temptation as human beings is to avoid that space because it's such an uncomfortable place to be. It's to protect ourselves, to engineer a life of safety where we don't have to risk and where we can avoid unpleasantness. But we know, in our sanest parts, because we're followers of Jesus, we know that that's just not a good bet for peace. That's not a good base for well-being or for hope. To put that in our circumstances is not a good formula for human thriving. George MacDonald, Scottish theologian, wrote this story called Thomas Wingfield. And it's an old story. It's not really riveting at all, but he's a great theologian. Lived a few centuries ago. And Thomas Wingfield is this young pastor whose life is filled with doubts. And in part of his story, he's talking to an older believer who is sort of on his deathbed. And this older believer has walked with Thomas in his young pastorate, and he knows he struggles with doubts. He knows he loves God, but he knows he has so many questions about God. And so this old-timer, this guy on his deathbed, he turns to Thomas and he says, "I wish after I died I could come back and tell you that it's true, that there's life after death, so you'd know for sure, and you know all about that beauty." And Thomas responds this way. This is kind of the chief mark of the book. He says, "I would rather not know one moment before God determines it's a good thing for me to know." He says, "I would rather have the good of not knowing." Isn't that so true? Like, if you could have the joy and the steadiness and the courage and the meaning in the not knowing of your story, you will grow far more as a person than anyone who would have the guarantee of knowing. Maybe right now you say, "I don't know what this present means for my future. Maybe I don't know about how what's going on right now is going to affect my business or my job or my children. Maybe I don't know what's going to happen if I take this risk for God, or if where I'm convicted about this in my life, I actually begin to change my securities. If I allow God to change my heart, if I take this step in faith, I don't know how it's going to work out." It's what psychologists call strategic uncertainty in character formation. This idea that to bank things on the basis of God, even though we don't know how it's immediately going to work out. This is resilient faith. This is faith that can't be penetrated because its base and foundation is not on what I desire for my life or what I can work out in my circumstances. I'm not negotiating with God for my favor. I am basing my hope in my life on Him and His major story and His purposes. Uncertainty is so central to your faith in God. Faith by definition is what? Walking not by sight. But our God's so gracious, He gives us some visibility. He gives us enough visibility. He promises. He makes all kinds of promises about our future. And most importantly, as we've learned with Joshua, He gives us His presence for today. Faith might be well defined as living a life where you have been able to make uncertainty feel comfortable, where you see all difficulty and hardship and challenge as an opportunity for God to do something in your life. In this messy middle, I can live with more love and more generosity and more availability and more losing self and more openness. We know the trajectory of God's story. Jesus has shown us that trajectory. We know the arc. And the end of the story is not death and loss, but it's resurrection and life. You know, it's really interesting if we go back to Rahab's story. The next time you hear Rahab's name outside of Joshua, it's actually in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 1. And we learn there that somehow God has woven her into his story, and she has become one of the great-great-grandmothers of Jesus. It's incredible. But there's another thing about Rahab's story, a phrase that comes up in the book of Hebrews that reminds me of Rahab. And it comes from this phrase in the Rahab story where she and her family were set outside the camp. Listen to Hebrews 13. Let us then go to him, talking about Jesus, outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Man, it's Rahab, isn't it? Somebody set outside the camp. Somebody who doesn't know exactly in this world, in this time, in this life, how all her circumstances are going to work out. But her base is in the eternal city, which is the life of God. You know, the symbol of our Christian faith has never been a victorious symbol. It's not some great throne. It's not where everything is worked out, maybe a crown. It's not a symbol of safety and settledness and prosperity. It's not a flag that we've planted because we know that the victory's already won and the battle's completely over. No, the symbol of our faith is the cross with its risky, self-giving love. And it's a love that flows down the beam of the cross like a crimson cord. So take that risk. Have courage. Have resilient faith. Keep persevering. Because, as David Rose shared with us in one of his devotional, the Savior that we serve is an incredible waymaker. In every circumstance in life, even today, even this season, all seasons, there are opportunities for growth. And we have the assurance that a resilient faith will be caught up in glory. Because you know in Jesus, you have been included in his story. And in his story, it's just incredible that those who lose their life and those who risk their life will find it. You know, I don't know what God's been doing in your heart and mind. I don't even know how you're responding to some of these messages and some of the songs we're sharing, some of the devotionals we're sharing. But you know, maybe today's an opportunity for you to get out of a faithless pattern, for you to get out of a life that's been full of anxiety and fear, and to make a recommitment to God, to repent and to change the trajectory of your life and align your story with him, to quit focusing on what you want. And boy, just look to the beauty and the majesty of how God is guiding things in this world. And maybe today is a day when you want to give your life to Christ and to his story, to be a part of the salvation progression that's going on. Maybe today you want to be baptized. If you're a member at Campus View, surely you have my cell phone number and you can text me if you want me to call you and pray with you. If you want to be baptized in the name of Jesus, text me. And if you're not a member at Campus View and you're watching this from somewhere else, you can go to our website and you can find email contacts and reach out to us that way. But take your hope in God. Don't be afraid of uncertainty and risk. Be strong and courageous. Be a person of resilient faith.